September 26, 1986, Jalalabad Airfield, Eastern Afghanistan. 16:47 hours local time. The Mi-24 Hind gunship had completed 72 combat missions without a single scratch. Its crew, Captain Gennady Seregin and Weapons Officer Lieutenant Mikhail Voronov, had flown more sorties over Nangarhar Province than any other crew at Jalalabad. They knew the terrain below them the way a surgeon knows a body. They knew which valleys funneled the wind, which ridgelines the Mujahideen used for observation, which villages had been pacified and which had not. They knew, most importantly, that the sky above Afghanistan belonged to them. The Hind was one of the most feared weapon systems on Earth. At 9 tons and armed with a 12.7mm chin gun, 128mm rockets, and anti-tank missiles, it represented the cutting edge of Soviet rotary wing technology. Its armored crew capsule could survive 23mm cannon fire. Its composite rotor blades could absorb rifle-caliber hits without failing. For 7 years, Soviet helicopter crews had operated over Afghanistan with a sense of functional invincibility, because no weapon available to the Mujahideen could reliably reach them. On this particular evening, Captain Seregin was escorting a resupply convoy toward the Khyber approaches. He was flying at 3,000 feet, slightly lower than doctrine recommended, because the western sun was behind him, and he was not thinking about threats from the ground. He had made this calculation hundreds of times. It had always been correct. At 16:51 hours, a Mujahideen commander named Ghaffar raised a 4.5-foot tube onto his shoulder. The tube had arrived 3 weeks earlier from a Pakistani intelligence facility in Peshawar. It had been manufactured in Troy, Alabama. It weighed 35 pounds. It had a seeker head that could track the infrared signature of a jet exhaust with an accuracy that the most sophisticated Soviet countermeasures could not defeat. Ghaffar fired. The FIM-92 Stinger surface-to-air missile covered the distance between Ghaffar's position and Captain Seregin's aircraft in approximately 4 seconds. The infrared seeker ignored the flares that automatic dispensers released in response to its lock tone. It did not care about the armored crew capsule or the composite rotor blades. It detonated against the engine exhaust port and tore the Hind apart in a fireball visible from Jalalabad Airfield, 12 miles away. Captain Seregin and Lieutenant Voronov did not survive. In Moscow, at a building on Kolpachny Pereolok that housed the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, an analyst named Colonel Viktor Blinov received the encoded field report 3 hours later. He read it twice. Then he walked to the office of his superior and said 5 words that would reverberate through the highest levels of Soviet power for the next 30 months. They have the Stinger now. To understand what those 5 words meant, what they destroyed, and what they ultimately cost, you must first understand what the Soviet Union believed about Afghanistan in September 26, 1986. The official Soviet term for the war was the phrase, the fulfillment of internationalist duty. It had begun in December 1979 when 3 airborne divisions descended on Kabul in an operation that Soviet planners estimated would require no more than 6 months to complete. 7 years later, 115,000 Soviet troops remained in a country the size of Texas, fighting an insurgency that showed no signs of exhausting itself. Soviet military doctrine had been built on a single foundational assumption that industrial capacity translated directly into battlefield dominance, and that Soviet industrial capacity was unassailable. This was not arrogance. This was mathematics. The Soviet Union had survived the German invasion of 1941 through the sheer crushing weight of its production capacity: 78,000 tanks, 100,000 aircraft, and artillery pieces numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Soviet military theory held that sufficient industrial output, combined with correct tactical application, would overcome any enemy. Afghanistan was supposed to be a laboratory demonstration of this principle. The numbers seemed to confirm it. At peak deployment, the Soviet 40th Army brought capabilities that dwarfed anything available to the Mujahideen. The Soviet Air Force operated more than 600 aircraft in the Afghan theater, including the Sukhoi Su-25 ground attack aircraft, the MiG-23 fighter, and above all the Mi-24 Hind, a machine that had no equivalent in any insurgent arsenal on Earth. Soviet artillery could deliver 152mm shells onto any target visible from observation posts. Soviet logistics could sustain an army of 115,000 men across the Hindu Kush indefinitely. The Mujahideen, by contrast, were equipped with weapons that in many cases predated the Second World War. Their primary anti-aircraft weapon through 1985 was the DSHK heavy machine gun, a 12.7mm weapon designed in 1938. They had no armor, no air force, no unified command structure, and a supply chain that ran overland from Pakistan in donkey caravans. General Viktor Yermakov, commander of the 40th Army from 1982 to 1984, summarized Soviet strategic thinking in a document recovered by Western analysts after the Soviet collapse. He wrote that the enemy is equipped at a 19th century level. Our material superiority is absolute. The operation will succeed when the enemy recognizes that resistance is futile against modern military power. This was the belief that Captain Seregin and Lieutenant Voronov had carried into the sky over Nangarhar Province on September 26, 1986. It died with them. The Stinger's arrival in Afghanistan was the product of a 2-year argument inside the American government, one that Soviet intelligence had failed to fully anticipate. Texas Congressman Charlie Wilson had been pushing the CIA to provide more capable weapons to the Afghan resistance since 1980. The CIA's position was that supplying American-manufactured weapons, especially the Stinger, risked provoking Soviet escalation and eliminating plausible deniability. Their preference was to channel Soviet bloc weapons purchased from Egypt and China and to keep American fingerprints off the war. Wilson's counter-argument was blunt. Soviet helicopters were not one component of the Soviet war effort. They were the war effort. They moved infantry across terrain no vehicle could navigate. They supplied mountain outposts that no road reached. They massacred Mujahideen formations that attempted to mass for conventional engagements. As long as the Mujahideen had no answer to Soviet air power, the insurgency could bleed indefinitely, but never win. In 1985, President Reagan signed a National Security Decision Directive authorizing Stinger transfers to the Afghan resistance. The CIA's budget for Afghan assistance had grown from $30 million in 1980 to $250 million in 1985, matched dollar for dollar by Saudi Arabia. The first Stingers entered Pakistan in late 1985. Training was deliberately brief. Load the battery coolant unit, acquire the target in the optical sight, wait for the acquisition tone, squeeze the trigger. By September 1986, approximately 150 Stingers had been distributed to Mujahideen commanders across several provinces. The missile that killed Captain Seregin was among the first used in combat. It would not be the last. In the 12 months following September 26, 1986, Mujahideen forces fired approximately 340 Stingers at Soviet aircraft, achieving a kill rate that CIA analysts later estimated between 60 and 80%. In the summer of 1987, a single Mujahideen commander in Kunar Province shot down 6 Soviet helicopters in 1 week. The numbers Colonel Blinov was tracking told a story Soviet military leadership found genuinely incomprehensible. Before the Stinger, Soviet helicopter losses in Afghanistan averaged approximately 12 aircraft per month, a sustainable attrition rate for a force of 600. After the Stinger, losses tripled within 6 months. More devastating than the absolute numbers was their distribution. The Stinger could reach aircraft operating at altitudes previously considered safe. The tactical sanctuary that Soviet pilots had inhabited for 7 years had ceased to exist. Marshal Sergei Sokolov, Soviet Minister of Defense, convened an emergency assessment in early November 1986 at the Ministry of Defense building on Znamenka Street in Moscow. General Mikhail Zaitsev, who had taken command of Soviet forces in Afghanistan in 1985, presented the briefing. He acknowledged the Stinger as a new tactical challenge, He proposed solutions within the existing framework: fly higher, fly faster, use terrain masking, develop new countermeasures. What Zaitsev did not say, and what no officer at Znamenka Street was prepared to say, was the thing Blinov had understood the moment he read the first kill report. The Stinger did not represent a new tactical challenge. It represented the end of the war. Soviet helicopter operations in Afghanistan were not one component of a complex military strategy. They were the load-bearing wall. Remove them, and the entire structure collapsed. The Soviet army was not designed for Afghanistan's terrain. It was designed for the North European plain, where armor maneuvered freely, where supply lines ran along paved roads, where the enemy came in conventional formations that firepower and maneuver could destroy. Afghanistan had valleys that channeled forces into kill zones, mountains that made vehicle supply nightmarish, and an enemy that dissolved before contact and reconstituted after it. Helicopters solved all of these problems simultaneously. They moved infantry across terrain that would have taken days on foot. They supplied outposts that no vehicle could reach. They provided fire support that compensated for the impossibility of massing artillery in high alpine terrain. A Soviet battalion without helicopter support in Afghanistan was a formation that could defend its base. A Soviet battalion with helicopter support could take the war to the enemy anywhere in the country. The Stinger was not, in the final analysis, a surface-to-air missile. It was a key that locked the door on Soviet offensive capability. And the Soviet General Staff, in November 1986, had not yet grasped what they were looking at. Colonel Blinov's intelligence assessment, completed in December 1986 and delivered to Deputy Chief of the General Staff General Valentin Varenikov, contained a calculation that should have ended the debate about Afghanistan's future. The Stinger supply pipeline could be estimated from quantities known to be entering Pakistan. Blinov's analysts believed the CIA was providing 60 to 80 missiles per month, with operator training proceeding continuously. At this rate, Mujahideen forces would possess operational Stinger capability in every major Afghan province within 18 months. The countermeasures available to Soviet forces were limited and, in Blinov's judgment, inadequate. Aircraft could fly higher, but the Stinger's maximum engagement altitude was not fully known, and conservative estimates suggested the missile could reach altitudes that made precision ground support essentially impossible. New infrared suppressors were under development, but their timelines ran 18 to 36 months, and their effectiveness against the Stinger's seeker was unproven. The Mujahideen did not need an industrial base. They needed only a continuous supply of a weapon someone else manufactured. The United States manufactured the Stinger at facilities in Arizona and Massachusetts. American production capacity meant the supply to Afghanistan was limited only by political will, and the CIA's Afghan budget was about to reach $630 million annually. The political will showed no signs of weakening. Blinov's report was received, filed, and largely ignored. General Varenikov later wrote in his memoirs that the December 1986 assessment had been noted, but considered overly pessimistic. The phrase was the Soviet military establishment's way of saying what Japanese Admiral Yamamoto's staff had said when he warned against attacking the United States in 1941, that the assessment was probably accurate, but politically unacceptable. The psychological mechanism that produced this response had been present in the institution since the first week of the intervention. Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, chief of the General Staff at the time of the 1979 invasion, had privately expressed skepticism about the operation's prospects. He understood that the Soviet Army's capability advantage over the Mujahideen was absolute in conventional terms and potentially irrelevant in unconventional ones. Vietnam had demonstrated that technological and industrial superiority could not, by itself, defeat an insurgency with a genuine popular base and an external supply line. Ogarkov was removed as Chief of the General Staff in 1984. His replacement, Marshal Sergei Akramayev, was chosen in part because he was more willing to believe in eventual Afghan success. This was not coincidence. It was the Soviet military establishment constructing an information environment where the truth about Afghanistan could not reach decision-makers in a form they were required to act upon. The same mechanism operated at every level. Field commanders who reported that pacification was succeeding were rewarded. Those who reported that their operations were achieving no lasting strategic effect were reassigned. Colonel General Yuri Maximov, who commanded the 40th Army from 1980 to 1982, wrote in private correspondence that he had submitted 3 separate assessments, concluding the military situation could not be resolved by military means alone, and received 3 separate reprimands for undermining unit morale. By September 1986, the Soviet military command structure had spent 7 years generating information that supported the institutional preference for believing the war was winnable. The Stinger shattered this not gradually through accumulated intelligence, but instantly through the undeniable reality of burning helicopters that the Mujahideen were filming and distributing across Afghanistan and Pakistan. They understood the psychological value of what they possessed. The footage of a Soviet Hind, the supreme symbol of Soviet military dominance, spiraling toward a mountain in flames, became the central visual document of the war's final phase. Every Soviet pilot who saw that footage understood something that no official optimism could negate. The sky was no longer safe. The tactical changes that followed were immediate, measurable, and strategically catastrophic. Soviet helicopter doctrine underwent comprehensive revision in early 1987. Minimum safe operating altitudes were raised dramatically in contested areas, from 3,000 feet above ground level to above 10,000 feet in some conditions. This single change effectively ended the close air support mission. A Mi-24 Hind attacking from 10,000 feet could not accurately engage individual fighting positions, could not suppress machine gun nests, and could not provide the precision fire support that had allowed Soviet infantry to operate in open terrain against entrenched defenders. Soviet infantry operations in contested areas became extraordinarily dangerous in ways they had not been since 1980. The Mujahideen recognized the change and adapted. Rather than avoiding contact with Soviet columns, the standard tactic of the mid-war years, they began staging ambushes in terrain where Soviet helicopters, even at high altitude, could not identify targets effectively. Major Ivan Petrov commanded a motorized rifle company in Nangarhar Province through the winter of 1986 to 1987. His company's operational diary documented the change across 9 months of entries. Before September 1986, the diary recorded helicopter support arriving within 12 minutes of contact on average. After September 1986, it recorded helicopter support, either absent or arriving at altitudes providing no effective fire suppression. In 7 separate engagements between November 1986 and July 1987, Petrov's company suffered casualties without meaningful air cover. In the mid-war period, that had been essentially unthinkable. Supply deteriorated in parallel. Forward mountain outposts that had been resupplied by helicopter. Every 3 to 4 days began receiving deliveries every 10 to 14 days. Some outposts were abandoned entirely. Positions that Soviet forces had held for years surrendered not to enemy assault, but to the impossibility of keeping men alive in them without air logistics. Others were resupplied by vehicle convoys through valleys the Mujahideen controlled, substituting one catastrophe for another. The ambush rate on ground supply columns tripled in the first year of the Stinger era, as Mujahideen commanders learned to predict where Soviet trucks would have to go now that helicopters could no longer go there. Logistics Colonel Andrei Smirnov, stationed at Bagram Air Base, calculated in the summer of 1987 that helicopter flight hours in the Afghan theater had declined 43% compared to the same period in 1985. Not because of mechanical failures, weather, or pilot shortages, because of Stingers. 43% of Soviet air mobility neutralized by a weapon weighing 35 pounds. The Mujahideen had not built an air force. They had not matched Soviet industrial output. They had not developed radar networks or anti-aircraft artillery systems. They had simply placed a missile in the hands of a man on a mountainside, and in doing so had accomplished what 7 years of conventional resistance could not. They had made the Soviet army fight a different war than the one it had trained for. And that different war was one the Soviet army could not win. In Moscow, the political landscape was shifting in ways that made continuing to ignore Afghanistan's strategic impossibility increasingly untenable. Mikhail Gorbachev had become General Secretary in March 1985, and from his earliest weeks in power, he had described Afghanistan in private meetings as a bleeding wound. He had inherited the war from 3 predecessors, Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko, each of whom had maintained it on the grounds that withdrawal would represent an unacceptable admission of failure. By 1987, with the Stinger crisis fully manifest, Gorbachev had reached a conclusion no Soviet leader since 1979 had been willing to state openly. The war could not be won. Continuing it would not merely fail to produce victory, it would accelerate the Soviet Union's internal collapse. The economic dimensions were precise and alarming. Direct military expenditures in Afghanistan ran 2 to 3 billion rubles annually. The indirect costs compounded this figure. The psychological damage to the Soviet Army's professional cohort, returning home disillusioned and in many cases addicted to the heroin Afghanistan produced in abundance. The damage to Soviet international prestige, which complicated the arms control negotiations Gorbachev considered central to his reform program, and the corrosive domestic fiction. By 1987, 13,833 Soviet soldiers had been killed in Afghanistan. Officially, most had died in training accidents, vehicle mishaps, or disease. The coffins arrived across the Soviet Union in transport aircraft, delivered quietly, with instructions that funerals should be private and tombstones should not mention Afghanistan. The KGB monitored compliance. This could not continue. The glasnost policy Gorbachev had introduced was making the fiction harder to maintain. Soviet journalists were beginning to report on the war with an honesty not possible under previous administrations. Mothers of soldiers were organizing, demanding accountability, asking in public the questions that had been asked only in private for 7 years. The Stinger had not created these pressures, but it had eliminated the one reserve possibility that Soviet leadership had always held in the back of its calculations, that the war might eventually turn, that the Mujahideen might eventually exhaust themselves, that Soviet forces might eventually achieve sufficient control to end the insurgency. With the Stinger, that reserve was gone. The war could now only get worse. Marshal Akhromeyev, who in 1984 had been selected partly for his willingness to believe in Afghan success, delivered the General Staff's assessment to the Politburo in November 1987 with a directness that surprised those who had observed his earlier positions. We have been in Afghanistan for 8 years. During this time, we have not managed to take full control of a single province. The situation is not improving. The Mujahideen's capabilities are improving. The Stinger has made our air operations in most of the country unacceptably costly. Continuing military operations will not produce different results. The equation has changed. The word equation was deliberate. Akhromeyev was a mathematician by training. The equation as he understood it now had a variable on the Mujahideen's side that had restructured every other term. Soviet industrial output had not declined. Soviet manpower remained available. None of this mattered because the fundamental relationship between Soviet capability and Afghan resistance had been permanently altered. Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze confirmed through back-channel contacts with American counterparts that the United States had no intention of halting Stinger supplies while Soviet forces remained in the country. The supply would not diminish. The equation would not change back. The Politburo authorized withdrawal negotiations in January 1988. The Geneva Accords, signed in April 1988, set the timetable. The last Soviet soldiers crossed the Friendship Bridge at Terme on February 15, 1989. General Boris Gromov, commander of the 40th Army, walked across last, alone, as the cameras of the world's press recorded the image. The full accounting of what the Stinger achieved operated across dimensions that resist any single summary. In military terms, from September 1986 to the February 1989 withdrawal, Mujahideen forces shot down an estimated 270 Soviet aircraft. More significantly, the threat of the Stinger neutralized hundreds of aircraft that were never struck, by forcing them to operate in ways that eliminated their effectiveness. In economic terms, the Soviet Union spent an estimated 40 to 50 billion rubles on the Afghan war in total, with costs accelerating sharply in the Stinger period. This expenditure fell during a collapse in global oil prices that had already eliminated crucial hard currency revenues, a convergence of pressures that would contribute directly to the fiscal crisis preceding the Soviet Union's dissolution. In human terms, 14,453 Soviet soldiers were killed, 35,000 were wounded, and an estimated 1 million Afghan civilians died across the decade of conflict. The arithmetic of the Stinger program itself is worth stating plainly. The Soviet Union produced, between 1979 and 1989, approximately 900 military helicopters for the Afghan theater. The United States provided roughly 2,000 Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen over the same period, at a unit cost of approximately $38,000 each. The total American Stinger investment for Afghanistan was roughly $75 million. The Soviet helicopter fleet it effectively neutralized represented a capital investment of several billion rubles. This is the arithmetic of asymmetric warfare. It is not the arithmetic that Soviet doctrine had prepared for. Colonel Viktor Blinov retired from the GRU in 1991, the same year the Soviet Union dissolved. In an interview with a Russian military historian in 1994, he was asked what he had understood on the evening of September 26, 1986, when he received the first Stinger kill report from Nangarhar Province. He said he had understood that the war was over. Not that it would end soon. Soviet forces remained for another 28 months after that evening, but that the outcome was determined in the same way a chess game is determined 3 moves before the final checkmate. The pieces would continue moving, but the result was fixed. He was asked why he had been able to see this when so many others could not. He said the answer was simple and uncomfortable. He had not been required in December 1986 to brief generals who needed reassurance. He had been required only to write the truth as the evidence presented it. The generals who received his assessment had a different requirement. They needed to believe the war was still winnable, because the alternative was an admission of 7 years of catastrophic error. The human mind, he observed, is extraordinarily skilled at finding reasons not to accept what it cannot afford to accept. He was asked why the general staff had been unable to see what he had seen. He thought for a moment and said something that applies not only to the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, but to every military establishment that has ever confused its institutional preferences with strategic reality. He said we had built a system for processing information that was very good at confirming what we already believed, and very poor at telling us what we needed to know. The Stinger reports came in. They were accurate. There were analysts who understood their implications perfectly. But there was no mechanism for that understanding to reach the level where decisions were made in a form that required action. The machine was designed to produce confidence. It was not designed to produce truth. Marshal Akramayev, who had delivered the honest assessment to the Politburo in November 1987, did not live to see the final accounting. He died by suicide in August 1991 during the failed coup against Gorbachev that preceded the Soviet Union's dissolution. He left a note that included the line, "Everything I worked for is being destroyed." The Soviet army that crossed back over the Terme Bridge in February 1989 was not the institution that had descended on Kabul in December 1979. It had learned at catastrophic cost that the relationship between industrial capacity and military outcome was far more complex than its doctrine described. It showed that a 35-pound missile could neutralize years of helicopter development and billions of rubles of investment. It showed that an enemy without a single aircraft factory could ground an air force. The missile exposed a vulnerability that doctrine had ignored. These lessons came too late to save the institution that learned them. The Soviet Union dissolved 28 months after the last soldier crossed the bridge. It was, by then, too late. The armed forces that had entered Afghanistan as the expression of a superpower's industrial and military confidence would exit history as the remnants of a state that had made a catastrophic error and spent a decade refusing to acknowledge it. The Stinger was not the cause of the Soviet Union's collapse. The causes were far deeper, including the structural failures of the planned economy, the erosion of political legitimacy, and the demographic and ethnic pressures that glasnost released rather than resolved. But the Stinger was the moment, the specific, datable, documented moment, when the gap between what Soviet leadership believed and what was true became impossible to paper over with official optimism. On September 26, 1986, a 35-pound American missile crossed 4 seconds of Afghan sky and struck a Soviet helicopter that its crew had believed was safe. In a war room in Moscow, an intelligence colonel read the encoded report of what had happened and understood before anyone else was willing to understand that the ground had shifted, not just in Afghanistan, everywhere. The Soviet Union's experience with the Stinger carries a lesson that is neither comforting nor unfamiliar. Every military power in history has built its strategy around its greatest capability and assumed that capability would be decisive. The Romans built their empire around the legion and assumed no barbarian formation could stand against it, until the Visigoths demonstrated otherwise in 410 AD. The battleship admirals of 1940 built their navies around capital ships and assumed no air attack could be decisive at sea, until Pearl Harbor and the sinking of HMS Prince of Wales demonstrated otherwise in December 1941. The Soviet Union built its Afghan strategy around helicopter dominance and assumed no insurgent weapon could neutralize it until September 26, 1986. The Stinger's deeper lesson is not about missiles or helicopters or the mathematics of asymmetric warfare. It is about the institutional mechanisms through which military establishments process unwelcome information. Colonel Blinov understood the Stinger's implications within hours of the first kill report. He wrote an assessment that accurately described what would happen to Soviet operations in Afghanistan. His assessment was filed and ignored for over a year because the institution that received it had no mechanism for acting on information that contradicted its existing commitments. This is the true cost of self-deception in military institutions. Not the battles lost, not even the lives lost, as devastating as those are. The true cost is the delay. The weeks and months and years between the moment an accurate assessment exists and the moment the institution acts on it. In Afghanistan, that delay was measured in lives, 14,453 Soviet soldiers dead, and 1 million Afghan civilians. It was measured in rubles, tens of billions spent on a mission whose failure had been predictable from the moment the Stinger arrived. And it was measured in something harder to quantify, the confidence of an institution in itself, the belief that its doctrine was sound and its judgment was trustworthy. That confidence did not survive the walk across the Termez Bridge. General Boris Gromov had served in Afghanistan twice. He had commanded operations in Kandahar and in Kabul. He had seen the war at its worst and its most ordinary. As he walked across the bridge alone on February 15, 1989, he carried the knowledge that what lay behind him had not been won. He carried something else as well. The knowledge that the Soviet military establishment had possessed the information it needed to make different decisions and had chosen, for institutional reasons, not to act on it. That the gap between what they knew and what they were willing to know had cost more than any external enemy could have extracted through force alone. 35 pounds of American engineering, manufactured in Troy, Alabama, had not merely shot down Soviet helicopters, it had held up a mirror. And what the Soviet General Staff saw in that mirror, what they spent 2 years refusing to look at directly, was the image of an institution that had confused its doctrine for reality, its preferences for facts, and its confidence for wisdom. They saw, in the end, the same thing that every military establishment has seen in its moment of reckoning, that the most dangerous enemy is not the one who fires the missile, it is the assumption that no such missile could exist.